I would like to share my screen and show you a little bit about the ARPA Institute before we start formally. So the ARPA Institute has been working in Armenia since 1992. And our website is arpainstitute.org, so you can visit our website and learn more about our activities. The first project that we have currently ongoing is we have built the first class 1000 clean room in the Azerbaijan National Lab, and we're still furnishing it with modern equipment. And also they're doing already experiments on what we call confined light, where they confine light to the surface of a solar cell, silicon solar cell, that has a very thin layer of silicon and some particles on it, nanoparticles. And when the light is confined on those particles, the efficiency of the solar cell absorption increases up to 50%, which is much more than the commercially available solar cells, which are around 22% efficient. And this makes it up to, so it's more compatible now with petroleum. We have also building a center of excellence for circuit design in the National Polytechnic University of Armenia, where they will learn how to design circuits using an international software, which is called Cadence, and Cadence has donated the software to the university. And we are building right now, we're currently there working on developing courses for the students to learn, and the teachers are being trained. We have educational programs in Armenia, in the north of Armenia, in 6 schools right now, and we are going to expand to 12 schools. And if anybody is interested and would like to sponsor a school, the annual cost of these programs is around $6,000 per school. We also have several other projects in the Azerbaijan National Lab. One is called the radio frequency photomultiplier tube, which essentially senses single photons coming from a laser system or any kind of pulse. And this has many applications in the industry, especially in medicine. So we're working towards the applications. And also they're working on developing new materials through small nanoparticles. Also, we have the annual invention competition for young scientists in Armenia that has been going on for 18 years now. This year is the 19th. So far, we have received a few inventions already, and we're hoping to get more. And also, we established the first science fair in Armenia, and the government is now adopted this program, and they already officially hold a national science fair every year. And we also sponsor small businesses in the border villages. We pay them a certain amount and also guide them through the business until they become profitable. We also donate very important instrumentation to different organizations in Armenia, different institutes. For example, physical science, physical chemistry institute, Institute of Physical Research, and several others. and Institute of Chemical Physics. Also in the Yerevan State University, the biological instrumentation. We also provide laptops and projectors with screens to schools that are in the border areas of Armenia, and they're essentially very needy schools. And also we hold these kind of either presentations or panel discussions for the public. And also we have in the past, of course, we have had many other projects, including the first blood bank, the modern blood bank in Armenia, in the Yerepuni Hospital. And also we had programs for students about health education and lifestyles for the 7th and 8th graders. And also, of course, we work with all the ministries and also the universities and institutions. We try to provide expert advice, guidance, as I said, instrumentation, and also develop new projects that we can achieve in Armenia. And we have a very good panel of experts today, and I thank every one of them. They are going to discuss Authoritarian, Unveiled, a socio-political assessment of Turkish and Azerbaijani presidents, Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Ilham Aliyev. The panelists are Ioannis Grigoriadis, Anahit Kartashian, Sevinj Samadzade, and Naira Sahakyan. The discussant will be Sara Crombach, and Naira will be the moderator. Right now, I'd like to ask Dr. Hurair Kabayan, who has helped me a lot, and he's one of the big organizers of these events, and he'll say a few words before we start. Hurair, the floor is yours.
Well, Howard, thank you very much for this introduction, and thanks for you and the ARPA Institute for sponsoring this event. I want to also, of course, express my many thanks to Dr. Naira Sahakyan for undertaking this event. This started, honestly, back in November of last year, so it's been several months. And at that time, it became very obvious, and people were, very much interested in a socio-political assessment of the two presidents, Erdogan and Aliyev, and people thought it may be very useful in many respects. So, Dr. Bruce Boosian, who is the president of AUA, put Naira and I in touch with each other, and the rest is history. Naira basically did. I'll be honest with you, Naira did all the heavy lifting, and she put in the team, and you will see the product today. So again, thank you for all the panelists who contributed, and to Naira for this great work. And Naira, over to you.
You're mute, Naira.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. So good morning and also evening, everyone, because it's already 10 p.m. in Yerevan, so it's also evening. I'm very happy to welcome you to our panel discussion on this recently published white paper, which is some kind of comprehensive exploration into the international relations and political dynamics of the Caucasus and the neighboring regions in general. As we know, the region's history has been very complicated, full of wars, tragedies, human losses, and unfortunately, the current situation is in some sense a continuation of all of that complex relationship. So today we are going to discuss the question of how the interplay between leaders, their personas, and narratives crafted around them can significantly influence the course of nations and entire regions. In general, the international relations theories very often ignore the political impact of individual level variables on politics. But there is an increasing acknowledgement that incorporating factors at the individual level, such as, let's say, perception and motivation, enhances our understanding of state behaviors. And that's why in our white paper, while accepting the structural factors as critical variables in explaining politics, we also emphasize that the individual level variables on politics are equally important. So that's why we are also focusing on that. Our focus is on two figures, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, President of Türkiye, and Ilham Aliyev, President of Azerbaijan. So maybe there will be a question, why these two figures together? So we assessed Erdogan and Aliyev jointly because of consideration of their collaboration and shared representation in many international and regional arenas, notably encapsulated by the phrase "Bir millet iki devlet," one nation, two states. And recently, this phrase became three-party, and it's now "Bir millet iki devlet bir yumru," one nation, two states, one first, which is more militarized version of it. This white paper is, as you can see, is authored by four quite experienced scholars, and it offers deep dive into the dimensions of leadership, power, and perception in the contemporary geopolitical landscape. So throughout our research and analysis, we tried to illuminate the socio-political dynamics surrounding these two presidents and to provide some kind of rich understanding of the forces behind their leadership styles and political strategies. One of the key strengths of this project, I would say, is the involvement of a multi-ethnic group of scholars. This diverse collaboration is essential in overcoming subjective and selective approaches, ensuring that our findings are well-rounded and truly valuable. So the variety of perspectives brought by our team tries to enrich the analysis, making the conclusions more comprehensive and insightful. But I would also like to say that one of the goals of this white paper is to spark ongoing research and stimulate discourse on this critical topic. So it's not designed for only academicians, but it's also target policymakers and practitioners to whom this paper would be very helpful as well. So I want to extend my thanks to all of you for joining us today. Your presence, of course, underscores the importance of this discussion and value of scholarly dialogue in addressing complex issues. I want to thank also our contributors, of course, the result of whose dedication is today's panel. And last but not least, I want to thank the initiator of this discussion. As you can imagine, our work is the result of several months of intense effort. And during that whole period, Dr. Heray Kabayan and Dr. Hagop Panosyan from the ARPA Institute were actively engaged, providing valuable support, edits, and insights. So their contribution have been instrumental in shaping the depth of the analysis presented in this white paper. So about the structure of today's panel, throughout our session, each contributor will present their work, offering insights into their research findings and implications of their analysis. Following this presentation, we will open the floor for discussion, which will be led by Dr. Sara Crombach from the University of Amsterdam. And then we will open the discussion for the audience. So please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box and we will come back to them. We will follow the sequence of the white paper contributors. So we will start with Dr. Ioannis Grigoriadis, who is an associate professor and Jean Monnet Chair of European Studies at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, Bilkent University. Dr. Grigoriadis' research interests include comparative European, Greek, and Turkish politics and history with the focus of nationalism and democratization. So without further ado, let us begin by welcoming our first presenter. And he will present his article, which is entitled "The Resurgence of Cult of Personality in Turkey and the Transformation of Azerbaijani-Turkish Relations." Dr. Grigoriadis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good evening to the panelists and to the audience, wherever they are. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you in this event. I would like to thank Naira for her good work that led to the production of this paper, also ARPA Institute for organizing this. What I would like to offer in this remarks, have to be around 10 minutes as we agreed, is a framework in order to better understand the role of personality in Azerbaijani-Turkish relations and overall the repercussions of these developments in regional politics. It is important to highlight that the role of personality is indexed to the role of institutions and the strength of institutions. In countries where institutions are strong, it is more difficult for personalities to play a stronger role. But under circumstances where institutions are weak or declining or captured, then personalities may make a big difference. And I would argue that there is an interesting increasing similarity between Azerbaijan and Turkey over the last few years. I'm not referring to the beginning of the Erdogan administration, but I'm referring to the last maybe 8 to 10 years that has contributed to this increasing convergence of views and sort of visions that Naira has also encapsulated in the phrase this third edition of this, which is the more sort of violent or the more sort of, let's say, aggressive sort of interpretation of this fraternity that has been considered as essential by a certain segment of Turkish political sphere. Not necessarily Erdogan himself in the first years of his administration, but eventually, yes, he did join this club. So what I would like to highlight here is a process that changed Turkish politics to a very significant degree. We may be following what we call as Turkish democratic backsliding in the last 10 to 15 years. That has developed in the backdrop of an effort about 20 years ago for Turkey to develop stronger democratic institutions and come closer to the European Union. There was a big discussion about Turkey's EU membership perspective. And this had triggered a very important reform process within the country. This reform process had touched upon almost every issue of domestic and foreign policy, and also influenced foreign policy in the Caucasus region as well. This is the time that when Turkey reconsidered its position on the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, on Karabakh, sort of tried to look into sort of opening new avenues of communication with Armenia. They considered new approaches on the Armenian genocide question. But as we know, there was an end to this. And the end to this was also linked with the rise of the cult of personality around the Turkish president. This is not something unique to Erdogan. I think it's very important to highlight that cult of personality is something strong in Republican Turkish politics. So we have Atatürk first, that became himself the charismatic leader that led Turkey out of a defeat in the First World War into sort of a new, like Western-oriented, but still a sort of sovereign sort of vision. So he was definitely a very interesting example of a charismatic leader for the whole region. But even after Atatürk, almost all political leaders in Turkey tried to highlight their charismatic personality as the reason for their political legitimacy. There were very few leaders that appeared to be hardworking, non-charismatic, but efficient because they relied on institutions and good cooperation, as is the case with many Western European leaders. So Adnan Menderes was one, like if you think about Süleyman Demirel, Turgut Özal, even lower like political leaders that made it to the head of the Turkish government or state for a very few months or years, like Necmettin Erbakan, would come from that tradition. They wouldn't be the sort of the bureaucratic or the technocratic politicians that would try to legitimize their position on the basis of their skills and abilities to deliver results. But they would be the father of the nation, right? The leader. There would be very disinteresting sort of approaches whereby the leader represents the will and the future of the nation. And of course, this leaves little ground for the operation of institutions and the operation of sort of reasoned debates. So Erdogan himself arose out of an environment which was not conducive to his rise as a charismatic figure from the beginning. Abdullah Gül and Bülent Arınç were also very important figures in the Justice and Development Party of the first years. You may remember that when Erdogan, when AK Party won the first elections in 2002, Erdogan was facing a judicial problem. Like he was not allowed to participate in the election, so he wouldn't be elected as an MP, and he wasn't the prime minister. It was Gül who was the first prime minister of the AK Party administration. And then they had to cause a by-election for him to become an MP and then become prime minister. So he had to share power to a considerable degree. And of course, his partnership with Fethullah Gülen, who later became his biggest enemy, and he was the Gülen movement became FETÖ in Turkey, was also a good example of how he had to share power. But as he developed in his administration and as he consolidated his position, he claimed this charismatic personality, and he reorganized the state around himself. And this contributed to the whole discussion about the constitutional reform and the rise of the presidential system that really consolidated every power in the hands of the president. I don't know whether you're following these days, there's a discussion that the president can declare war without asking the Council of Ministers or the Parliament, which is interestingly a departure from something that even the presidential constitution of today's Turkey had deprived from the president. The president cannot declare war or declare emergency situation by himself. So why am I saying all this? Because Azerbaijan was already there and Turkey was moving in that direction. So from the establishment of the Republic of Azerbaijan, we have a sort of a very autocratic, very personality-based, like family sort of run country, whereby, of course, it is clear that the leader is the beginning and the end of the state, and legitimacy has to be identified as loyalty to the leader. So there are no institutions that operate against the will of the leader. And I would say that in the first years of the AK Party administration, there were significant divergences between Turkey and Azerbaijan. Like many many supporters of Turkey's EU vocation would highlight that despite the cultural and ethnic or religious links of Turkey with the Middle East or Central Asian or like countries or Azerbaijan. There was a clear demand and desire that Turkey looks more like Southern European countries. But this kind of ended around 2010 when the Gezi sort of uprising or events happened, and then Erdogan felt very concerned about kind of his the future of his administration. So he shifted gears, and we witnessed what we call as democratic backsliding. And in that respect, very importantly, he abandoned the Kurdish peace process and decided to join forces with the MHP, the far-right nationalist action party. I think that was crucial, both for him improving his relations with Azerbaijan, because MHP is the party that has historically had very good relations with Turkic nationalists and the Central Asian states, and with the Aliyev regime as well. Erdogan didn't have excellent relations from the beginning of his administration with Aliyev. But his decision to ditch the Kurdish peace process and give up on his efforts to appeal to the Kurdish population of Turkey provided an opportunity for him to consolidate himself as the leader of the right and the far right. And of course, in this environment, the cult of personality is more kind of working. It is something that really sort of delivers results, because right and far right wing voters are likely to expect and accept a leader with a charismatic personality, as Erdogan would eventually be. I think that that was a very important development that had profound consequences, both in Turkish domestic politics, but consolidated a democratic backsliding. It consolidated a constitutional reform that produced this sort of new presidential system, whereby it is no longer the cabinet, it is no longer the foreign ministry that produces decisions on foreign policy, but it is the president and his close group of advisors. But also allowed for this very special relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan to develop, which we've witnessed in very recent developments. I think that was something that was quite remarkable, and has contributed to something that I kind of mentioned towards the end of my paper, my presentation, that Azerbaijan has managed, for a number of reasons, like economic, strategic, and military as well, to acquire some disproportionate influence on Turkish foreign policy making and planning, especially in the Caucasus region. I refer to a paper written several years ago on a topic that is unfortunately, again, very, very topical, which is US foreign policy in the Middle East and the role of the Israel lobby in shaping US foreign policy in the Middle East. So there was a paper by Mearsheimer and Walt whereby they argued that Israel had exerted a disproportionate influence on US foreign policy planning in the Middle East, which ended up being detrimental to US interests as well as legitimate Israeli interests in the Middle East, by not paving the ground for a viable and sort of fair solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestine question. So my final point for this presentation, of course, I will be happy to discuss this in detail later, is that this transformation of Turkish politics through the rise of the cult of personality has contributed to a situation whereby Azerbaijan has had a veto power de facto on very important issues that touch upon Armenia-Turkey relations, or Turkey-Georgia relations, or Turkey-Russia relations in the Caucasus as well, which is really unprecedented. And it's interesting as an example of how the institutionalizing foreign policy and putting emphasis on personalities and the word of leaders and the relationship between leaders can lead us to. So there is a lot of unpredictability and a lot of course, of potential for risk and instability in the region. Why? Because what institutions are meant to do is to try to find the most efficient and risk-averse solutions in a number of conflicts. When institutions don't exist or decline, then risks are getting higher. So I'll stop here and look forward to our discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And our next presenter is Anahit Kartashian. She's a lecturer at the Institute of Oriental Studies in Russian Armenian University, and she is also a PhD candidate at St. Petersburg State University on Ottoman studies, and she's focusing on empire and nationalism within the Ottoman and Russian empires. So her PhD research is on the formation and political development of Ottoman Armenian elites during the Tanzimat. But today she is going to present her paper, which is called Sultan Who Never Became a Caliph, Izvestia Portrays the President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Anahit?
Thank you very much, Naira. As you mentioned, I'm focused on Ottoman history, and thank you, because I got away from the Ottoman reality and we came to nowadays. My presentation and my paper, the title of my paper is Sultan Who Never Became a Caliph. The title I took from the Izvestia because I think that this characterizes the whole process that I analyzed. Okay. What I'm going to talk today is how during several events in Russian-Turkish relationship, the image of President of Türkiye changed from positive to negative tone. The conceptual framework of this research is media framing, which in communication studies, it says that news stories include information and framed. Mass media uses news frames to exert a relatively substantial influence on citizens' beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. Mass media can highlight some, let's say, unimportant events in order to overshadow more important political developments. A frame itself unifies information into a package, and package can include arguments, information, symbols, metaphors, and images. In this presentation, I'll try to show how frames changed during some cases in Russian-Turkish relationship, and this frame, in the context of these frames, symbols, metaphors, and images of Recep Tayyip Erdogan changed. As I already mentioned, I used, as a source of this research, I used the Russian newspaper Izvestia, which is a Kremlin loyal newspaper. And if I may make a quick overview on Russian-Turkish relations, so I can say that the process of establishing partnership relations between Russia and Turkey, which began in the late 90s and gained momentum in the early 2000s, has not gone smoothly without problems. Russian-Turkish relations has ups and downs, very difficult situations, but somehow they managed to manage this, settle this conflict, and it especially was during the administration of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin. The relationship between two countries during the administration of these two presidents is the most benevolent in the entire history of Russian-Turkish relations. And in Turkey, even call Recep Tayyip Erdogan our Turkish Putin. In the historiography of Russian-Turkish relations, there are different conceptual approaches related to the Russian-Turkish relationship. Some experts characterize them as interconnected, believing that it's an asymmetric interdependence in which Russia has a number of advantages over Turkey. In early 90s, Russian political leaders, experts were searching some conceptual or ideological access for Russian-Turkish relationship. And it's become the concept of Eurasia. At the beginning, the Russian Eurasianism and Kemalist Eurasianism in Turkey could be common point for their could be a common point. But then when the AKP came into power, the Kemalist Eurasianism changed into neo-Ottomanism. During this paper, I'll discuss Syrian crisis, the Crimean crisis, and the aircraft crisis. And using these three events, I'll show how the frames, how the image of Erdogan changed. During the Syrian crisis, we can see that there are frames, there are passive frames about the relationship between Recep Tayyip Erdogan and ISIS. The Russian newspaper Izvestia write about oil trade between Turkey and ISIS, about the Erdogan stance business with ISIS, but this frame was very passive. In communication studies, there is an idea that the more you mention topic, the powerful it becomes. This kind of news and editorials about the business with ISIS, they are rare during the Syrian crisis, but they were. So Russian experts, editors, politicians, in their articles, for Erdogan uses such characteristics, such positive images like thorough politician, brilliant orator, experienced and wise leader, grandmaster, and of course partner. And Turkey also characterized as partner country. Right after Crimean crisis, we can see we can follow the frame of Sultan and Caliph, and still Turkey and Recep Tayyip Erdogan are partners, is partner, but the image of Sultan and Caliph is in negative tone, used in negative tone. In 2000, on 24 of November in 2015, after the downing of Russian aircraft, the tension between Russian-Turkish relationship was revived. And right after this crisis, the frames and image of Erdogan negatively changed. Russian experts, politicians, and editors use such a characteristic as macho-janissary, leader who loses sense of reality, an authoritarian personalist leader, a puppet in the hands of NATO, in particular the USA, dark, deliberately rude being, unreliable sultan. What about why did Izvestia also always talk about uses such words, such characteristic as Sultan or Caliph. Russian politician Nikolai Zadulin, when talked about this situation, talked about this situation in Russian-Turkish relations, he said that in Russian culture, the image of Ottoman Empire as enemy country is a resident. So frequent references to this frame aims to emphasize the attribute of image of Erdogan and Turkey as an enemy country. This because at the beginning, when the aircraft downed, all experts said that it shouldn't be any war between Russia and Turkey, but we should somehow punish. We should press economically, diplomatically, and the narrative of apologize came. What kind of frames they used during in their articles and editorials? Again, we see that the frame of relationship between Turkey and ISIS, oil trade, corruption, became active frame. Every article, every paper that published Izvestia after the aircraft crisis, they all talk about oil trade with ISIS, Erdogan's son's relationship with ISIS. The second important frame was the Armenian genocide and the genocide of Kurds in Turkey. So using these frames, actively using these frames, Russia wants to make diplomatic and economic pressure on Turkey. Why economic? Because when you activating the image of enemy country, your citizens, and as we know, the huge part of economy, not huge part, but important part of economy of Turkey includes the tourism. So in that days, Russia was calling its citizens not to go to Turkey as a resort country because it's enemy country. It has an Islamic leader, and the lives of their citizens maybe will be in danger. So using these frames, Russia wanted to make a pressure on Turkey. So if we sum up, we can say that under the condition of sanctions rooted in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, Russia aimed to keep Turkey as a partner country, not as an enemy. By creating a positive image of Erdogan, they extended it to Turkey as well. But at the same time, they also keep it in background frames containing negatively attributes that can be highlighted to suppress Turkey if necessary. And the aircraft crisis was a vivid example when Russia used the negative image, negative frames, just to make the diplomatic and economic pressure on Turkey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anahit. So we are moving forward, and our third paper is prepared by Sevinj Samadzade. Sevinj is a feminist researcher and an activist in the field of feminist international relations and security, with particular interest in post-Soviet geopolitics, social work, and movements in the South Caucasus. She is the co-founder of Feminist Peace Collective, which is very active. And she's working on her PhD at Ghent University on the interaction between global and local social warfare provisions to women in Georgia. So her today's paper is entitled Aliyev's Enduring Authority, Unraveling Masculine Governmentality and Authoritarian Traditionalism in Azerbaijan. Sevinj, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Naira. Thank you very much. And it's very interesting after these last two presentations to now delve more into a bit of feminist politics and feminist governmentality. So my paper, I would like to start by saying that, first of all, the theory that I looked into was one of the challenges for me, because governmentality in general is very much widely used theory in explaining certain levels of how power is distributed and how different forms of governmentalities, disciplining measures, and other governing apparatus are enhanced within the authoritarian or liberal democracies. But why Azerbaijan is a case study? I think in general today what we see in our region and also beyond is strengthening masculine governmentality and authoritarian traditionalism. This is a trend, and it's very much widespread in certain countries where gender is being used or instrumentalized by the government to further strengthen their powers. This might include Russia, China, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, and many other countries. But the idea for Azerbaijan, we know Azerbaijan is an authoritarian regime, and we know that especially after the war in Karabakh in 2020, the Aliyev got power that made him give him almost like a godlike status in Azerbaijan. So my paper basically starts with this statement by former mayor of Baku, who once said, like 10 years ago, he said that there is only one man in Azerbaijan and he's our president. That time, when 10 years ago this statement was published, was said to one journalist in Azerbaijan, it created a lot of rage, it created a lot of discussions, because that time Aliyev didn't have as much popularity as he has now. But what we see over the course of these 10 years is the dynamics that made me think of how actually the masculinity and governmentality are interconnected in giving Aliyev so much power beyond just the victory or the narratives around the victory that he had in Karabakh. And this theory of governmentality, of course, fundamentally lies with the post-structuralist theories, including the Foucault, Derrida, and many others. But the main theory comes from Foucault, who explains power as a dynamic force, as a diffusive force, shaping both individuals and the societal behavior. And usually governmentality as a theory is widely used in hybrid, liberal, or transitional democratic regimes to explain how the power is circulating between society and state and society, and less often in authoritarian regimes. Because if we say that power is diffusive, power is dynamic, then it kind of feels like it doesn't necessarily apply to the dictatorships or to authoritarian regimes. But interestingly, unlike the time when Foucault was alive, and unlike the time when global economy wasn't as much globalized as now, and unlike the times when the neoliberalism was so widespread, which it is now so much widespread, we have a new forms of governmentalities which also includes the authoritarian regimes and the way they handle power, or the power circulate in these regimes. And that's why it makes also very much relevant for Azerbaijan. But one thing specifically that connects governmentality with authoritarianism is the aspect of gender. So that's where I point the line, and that's where I have specifically looked. So how is it connected? First of all, how these disciplinary powers, which one of the powers that Foucault explains, is used or has been used in liberal democracies or in any form of political structures. Where it put it a very simple way, it even involved very small controlling practices that makes individuals submissive or makes individuals come to this certain hegemonic consent with the government. Of course, feminists have been very much critical of Foucault's conception of power because if power is dynamic, then what about the power that is dominating? Because in feminist studies, we always we have been more critical of power as dominating force. And this is also very much prevalent in Marxist, post-Marxist studies where power is seen as dominating force as well. But unlike the Marxists, which see power mostly as a dominating force, which applies to authoritarian regimes definitely because there the power is circulating from top down. We also see how much different disciplining measures the authoritarian governments use. And this power dynamics are usually are sometimes very visible, but sometimes they are invisible and very repressive in nature, but very invisible. And that's why one of the questions for Azerbaijan is, for instance, why so far also in the region, as there have been so many dynamics of revolution, regime change, this hasn't come to Azerbaijan. So why? Is it just because it's a rentier state, it's an oil state, is it because Aliyev and his crony capitalism has enforced like the whole levels of society, or is it something else? Is it beyond just what we imagine as a traditional way of regime change? And of course, the big question, I'm not delving in this paper on this question, but there is a little bit of answer perhaps in my paper, why. And I want to start by a little bit narrating or shaping the history of this masculine governmentality. So my main theory is the masculine governmentality, which is very much prevalent in Azerbaijan, and it is continuity of the father-son dynamics between Heydar Aliyev and Ilham Aliyev, as they have been ruling Azerbaijan for many decades, if we include Heydar Aliyev's leadership in the Soviet time as well. Of course, this dynamics for people studying Middle East might sound very familiar, monarchic way of continuity of power, but very much precisely, if we want to put it in a picture in the global political regimes, one of the most similar ones looks like Syrian regime, where the Assad's father, by the way, at the same time Heydar Aliyev came to power in Soviet Union, Assad's father also came to power in Syria. So there's very much similarities in these regimes, but there are also differences, of course. But what happened with the father-son dynamics of Heydar Aliyev and Ilham Aliyev? And I specifically look at this because usually it seems like this inheritance of power from Heydar to Ilham created continuity of everything that Heydar inherited, but there are certain differences, and that is what makes Ilham now so much popular. And this transfer of power is also related to what Heydar Aliyev actually inherited. And a few years ago, 10 years ago again, when this conversation was happening, one of the former political opposition leaders, maybe some of you know him, Zardish Alizadeh, he is also a scholar, sometimes writing about different issues. And 10 years ago, he commented and he said that when someone asked him what is the biggest inheritance of Heydar Aliyev, Zardish Alizadeh said that it is his son, Ilham Aliyev. And that time, again, this didn't seem very much a legitimate answer, but today we see why he was saying that. And Ilham's, I looked in this paper a little bit to Ilham's background and how this transfer happened, because the transfer that happened in 2003 seemed for us that it is, of course, very monarchic way of transitioning power, but also there was something very interesting happening, and that was the image of Ilham, and to put it in a different way, symbolic change in leadership, because whatever Heydar Aliyev inherited from as a Soviet era bureaucrat apparatchik, whatever he created in the 90s were the power that brought Ilham further. But when the Ilham was emerging, he was emerging not as a Soviet era bureaucrat or Soviet educated bureaucrat, but more of a Western oriented bureaucrat. He was emerging as a liberal with a global outlook, and I'm referring, actually quoting what that time Heydar Aliyev's government thought, and also, by the way, not only Heydar Aliyev's that time government thought that Ilham is the best Western-oriented liberal, but also the Western governance themselves also thought that Ilham is the figure that is leaning towards liberalism. And it's not completely wrong, because what we see now is that Ilham Aliyev got rid of most of these old Soviet era bureaucrats, and eventually he brought his own Western educated loyalists who are showing this facade of Western friendly governance structures. But what stayed after the Ilham came to power, of course, I'm not going to talk like in much in depth about the political economy that changed, but more of the symbolic change. And this symbolic change again comes through this masculine image of Ilham and Heydar, which was prevalent everywhere, from schools to shops to kindergartens. You can imagine in every levels of society, Ilham and Heydar's father to son pictures were circulating everywhere, but this was mainly centering around the cult of Heydar Aliyev, so-called Heydarism, which was strategic use of Heydar Aliyev's cult to control and discipline populations. And this image of Heydar being prevalent in school, offices, public spaces was very much reinforcing his hegemonic masculinity. And just to note on this, that the Heydarism cult was so strong and so symbolically and materially was so strong that in every aspect of society, Heydar Aliyev was living, actually was alive. But this cult also helped Ilham Aliyev to switch to transfer to his own cult after the 2020 war happened, and the victory of course gave him lots of popularity, but also gave him a chance to switch from his father's cult to his own cult. And that's why the symbolic transition that happened is very much related to war. This is one of my chapters where I'm trying to explain how the war is leading to this hegemonic masculinity. But there is, of course, these disciplinary measures, which I in the beginning mentioned, and that is where the governmentality lies, and that's where a lot of tactics are being used from in the way the Russian government uses, for instance, engaging youth, engaging media, engaging education, and different other disciplinary institutions in creating this cult and loyalty. And the creation of loyalty already starts since the Ilham Aliyev comes to power, but it evolves and it changes over time. And there comes specifically the neoliberal part of this governmentality, where gender plays a huge role. And this is where the traditionalism, which we see as an old way of governing, for instance, putting family as a central value to the governmentality or to the societal societal values. Also, it remains, but it goes further by saying, by being more selective about modernity. For instance, saying that we appreciate certain aspects of Western modernity, which in reality means the economic and globalized neoliberal economy that we accept and we further reinforce. But some aspects of modernity is rejected. And here we see anti-LGBT and anti-woman and other discourses emerging. And here we also see the facade of equality in terms of Ilham Aliyev's wife, Mihriban Aliyeva, coming to power, and not only her, but also many women being included in the governing structures. And this inclusion and this women's inclusion in certain power structures is a very well-known neoliberal strategy to appear progressive while maintaining the gender hierarchies. Of course, it has many reasons why Mihriban Aliyeva got so much power in the governance, being interlinked and owning most of the businesses and market in Azerbaijan. But it also symbolically played a huge role for Ilham Aliyev to remain his power when it was a bit more fragile. I'm talking again before 2020. And her appointment as vice president and representation of peace, harmony, and love provided Ilham a certain level of, at a time when the ideal feminine image was important to create, gave Ilham some time to consolidate his power. And I want to move to the final section, talking a little bit about how the transformation of gender regime happened, especially post-Karabakh War. That's where we see that militarization was part of the Azerbaijani society for a long time. And militarized masculinities was shaping the way society was functioning. For instance, at schools, how most of the schools are named after some sort of war heroes. Most of the job market for men especially requires military service. So this kind of militarized masculinity is very much prevalent both in a material and a symbolic level, and it extends specifically after the war, because now it seems as not just a material and symbolic base for the society, but also an existential fundament for the society. And this gives Ilham a huge chance to propagate more his militarization and authoritarianism. Through, for instance, this year when Ilham was elected president again, he specifically mentioned the value of family values, and this already gave us signals why this narrative of family values comes back. Of course, this is not new, or this is not exceptional for Azerbaijan, but this is very interesting from where these narratives are being coordinated, and why now Ilham Aliyev needs family values to start his fifth term of presidency. And yes, I will conclude by focusing on the everyday disciplining measures, which is also connected with the masculine governmentality. This includes general use of propaganda, fear-mongering, and myth-making scheme that is prevalent in Azerbaijan. And this is precisely why the public consent still remains. So one of the reasons why the dissent in Azerbaijani society, of course, the political opposition media, especially since last year, has been facing a large crackdown. But this crackdown also comes with the huge public consent that either is indifferent to what is happening, or they have certain consent to the narratives that the government provides. And Ilham Aliyev's figure as a savior of the nation, and perhaps now even further aiming for the peacemaker, I think creates this consent, contributes to this consent, but also gives some sort of safety to the population. And again, we are back in this loop of choosing safety and security over the democracy or freedoms. And finally, there is certain resistance that challenge this everyday disciplining, and of course, it comes from mostly feminist movement or feminist resistance, and that's why the gendered violence, that is, including the police violence, surveillance, and general societal norms that enforce gender roles, are being challenged by the local activists. And in this kind of complicated situation, I think my conclusion will be that there is a chance for a new political stance that will go beyond traditional opposition, and that is where a certain the nuance and gender-aware approach might help to challenge the existing traditionalism and masculine governmentality in Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sevinj, for this brilliant presentation. And well, the final paper of this panel will be presented by me. So my name is Naira Sahakyan. I'm an assistant professor in history at the American University of Armenia. So today I will talk about, my paper has a lot of links to what just been discussed by Sevinj. So I'm going to talk about Ilham Aliyev's sources of legitimacy after 2 decades of rule. I've been working on analysis of Ilham Aliyev's speeches, maybe recent 2 years, and I read nearly all of his speeches. It wasn't an easy task. In this paper, I aimed to analyze the characteristics of Ilham Aliyev's legitimacy narratives and the nuances of its transformation. And I tried to shed light on the strategies employed by him to bolster his legitimacy, focusing on the domestic discourse. So it's mainly about domestic discourse. I paid attention to the case of Azerbaijan, specifically examining how Aliyev constructs a discourse around his legitimacy and cultivates belief among Azerbaijanis. So about my argument, I argue that prior to the 2020 Karabakh War, Aliyev positioned himself as a leader whose legitimacy stemmed mainly from his familial lineage, particularly his father's legacy. However, following the war, there was a notable shift in narratives, emphasizing Aliyev's personal qualities and his ability to govern effectively, setting him apart from both Azerbaijani society and opposition forces. This shift in emphasis toward his leadership qualities, underscored by military success and widespread popular support that was mentioned by Sevinj as well. So by kind of leveraging the 2020 war and emphasizing his personal qualities, Aliyev expanded the source of his legitimacy beyond solely relying on his father's image. At the beginning, to be honest, when I started noticing this shift, I was thinking that he's going to change the source of his legitimacy. But then I realized that he's just trying to diversify it, not completely to change it. While I was writing this paper, I came across this book, The Legitimation of Power by David Beetham, who talks about the threefold structure of legitimacy rule-derived justifiability of power rules and expressed consent. So here my main examination relates to the justifiability of power rule in the context of which Bitam speaks about the legitimacy deriving from an authoritative source. He divides those sources into external, such as divine will, natural law, scientific doctrine, and internal, like society in the past. So in the case of Azerbaijan, I think we are mainly talking about the internal source and particularly the society in the past on behalf of Heydar Aliyev, whose role plays an iconic image in his son's narrative. Furthermore, as Bitam states, this also favors rules of succession, such as hereditary, which embody continuity with the past. So this is also very important in the case of Aliyev, not only to justify his 2 decades old rule, but also, I assume, to prepare next step, which might be coming of his son. I don't know, but maybe. An important part of Bitam's theory is what he called justifiable content of rules. And there is 2 principles related to this. The first one is principle of differentiation between dominant, which is Ilham Aliyev, and the subordinate, which is Azerbaijani society in this case. And the second principle is demonstration of common interest uniting dominant and subordinate. Both are very important, and we can see how it works in the case of Azerbaijan. So the first one is a key to distinguish the dominant from the subordinate. And why they try to distinguish, it's because they try to justify their respective access to and also exclusion from essential resources, activities, and positions, of course. And the second principle, on the other hand, relates to the common interest that links the dominant with the subordinate, and that distribution of power serves the interests of subordinate and not only those powerful alone. So for the case of Azerbaijan, as one can see, this is mainly about Nagorno-Karabakh. So recapturing the Nagorno-Karabakh and revenge against against Armenians plays that role of common interest. In Azerbaijan, Aliyev became a president in 2003, following his father, who was in charge since 1993. Though, if we count also his rule from the Soviet time, it would be from 60s. But it wasn't that easy, and to deal with his opposition and avoid any nationwide uprising against his rule, Aliyev has been developing these narratives designed to legitimize his rule, stem from the authoritative figure of his father. It was at the beginning, of course. And the narrative of his father was the most widespread story in his speeches. In many of his speeches, Aliyev addresses the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. To be honest, only rare speeches that don't address that issue. But when he addresses Azerbaijani audience, Aliyev frames the conflict and the history of the dispute in a way that strengthens the legitimacy of Aliyev dynasty. So while the responsibility of the conflict is expectedly still attributed to Armenia, one of the primary functions of Ilham Aliyev's rhetoric becomes polishing the Aliyev's reputation. In almost all of his speeches, Aliyev attributes Armenia's victory in the First Karabakh War not to the Armenian military force or any leader in Armenia, but to the internal problems in Azerbaijan in the early 1990s. which he argues are resolved by Heydar Aliyev when he came to power. And as Bitam states, the authoritative internal source, such as tradition or elders, favors rules of succession, embodying continuity with the past, I've already mentioned. And Ilham Aliyev's reign is represented as a continuation of his father's rule and policies. And in many of his speeches, you can see this narrative when he says that the Azerbaijani people had so much wisdom that first they asked Heydar Aliyev to take power, and then they gave the mandate to his son, because they wanted to see his the continuation of his policy. So this is very widespread narrative in his speeches. And that's why the reference to Heydar Aliyev is foundational, as it refers to the establishment of this dynastic rule. This justifiable content of rule also revolves around two main aspects. As I mentioned, the principle of differentiation, the dominant figure from the subordinate, and the domination and demonstration of shared interests that unite both parties. So prior to 2020 and continuing post-2020, the narrative surrounding the Karabakh conflict remains central, of course, and presenting its resolution in favor of Azerbaijan as a shared interest of both the Aliyev family and Azerbaijani society. So the discourse has remained relatively consistent, emphasizing this shared interest. But the alteration in Ilham Aliyev's discourse becomes apparent when examining the principles that differentiate the dominant leader from the subordinate. So before 2020, the narrative, as I mentioned, predominantly revolved around Heydar Aliyev and Ilham Aliyev as his son. But in the aftermath of the 2020 war, a notable shift occurred. Ilham Aliyev found himself leading a transformed nation following Azerbaijan's victory. And the 2020 Karabakh War became a new source of legitimacy for Aliyev. That's why pre-war speeches often referenced Heydar Aliyev as a source of legitimacy and continuity. Yet in the post-war era, Ilham Aliyev's speeches began to emphasize his own role in the recent triumph, marking a shift toward these narratives that highlights his personal authority and quality rather than relying on his father's figure. So if you read speeches of Aliyev from 2020, late 2020, you will see that in this new situation, the eye of Ilham Aliyev is sharply highlighted. In many of speeches, he is talking about himself doing something, himself leading nation, himself kind of crafting victory. And even what was interesting, that even the mosque that is going to be built in Shushi, he says that it will be his design, even in that case. So he's even playing an architect of that case. So but I want to stress that it's essential to note that while references to Heydar Aliyev may have diminished in frequency, they have by no means disappeared entirely from Ilham Aliyev's speeches. And Aliyev began to assert his own authority more prominently, aligning himself with the victorious outcomes of the recent conflict. And his speeches portrayed him not just as the someone who continues his father's role, as I already mentioned. And coming back to the findings of this paper, the analysis demonstrated that Ilham Aliyev instrumentalized the 2020 war to foster belief among the Azerbaijani people in his personal qualities as a leader capable of guiding the nation to victory. In doing so, he distanced himself from his father, although this distancing was quite nuanced, as he still relied on an authoritative source from his legitimacy, which can be derived. This indicates that Aliyev didn't entirely change the source of his legitimacy, but rather he diversified it. And consequently, these sources are culminative and complementary rather than alternative requirements of legitimacy. So, and it makes probably even he makes him even stronger in nowadays Azerbaijan. And if you follow the news, you can see that his son recently started appearing in many of pictures, like a picture where he stands next to his father, and they are trying to and it was in front of this Turkish Yuav Akıncı. So it's quite interesting situation, and well, we'll see how the situation changes. Thank you very much for listening, and now I'll continue as a moderator, not as a panelist. So and I want to give a floor to Sara Crombach, who is a professional musician and a lecturer at the Department of East European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. So after spending time in Russia and the Caucasus, working with refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh, she devoted her PhD research to the impact of history writing on politics, myth-making, and nation-building, and ultimately, of course, conflicts. So Sara Crombach gives concerts and concert lectures on music from the former Soviet Union, Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asian, Central Eastern Europe, and Turkey, and many of videos you can find in YouTube and enjoy because they are very, very beautiful. Sara, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Naira, for your very kind introduction. Thank you also the ARPA Institute for organizing this wonderful, for taking the initiative to the project and organizing this small conference. I think it's a very important initiative in these worrisome times, certainly. I have, several questions for all of you. Thank you all four. It was a great pleasure for me to read all your papers and to listen to your presentations. Thank you very much. Well, my first question is actually for the ARPA Institute. You introduced us to the many important and wonderful things ARPA is organizing for Armenia. My question to ARPA would be, what about, are you also involved in organizing, let's say, a mediation between Armenia and countries that are bordering Armenia? Is there a cooperation with non-Armenian NGOs, for instance? It would be interesting for me to know more about that. And secondly, as you said, I think Naira said so, that one of the goals of this project is to spark research, which indeed is a very, very important goal. Then secondly, it would be very important and interesting to target also to policymakers. What about the possibilities with regard to spreading this white paper, and what could we expect from policymakers, and what kind of policymakers do you think of? In the first place, maybe the EU, but there are many, many others. So far, some general questions. And then, well, I ordered all my questions according to your papers, but please feel free to answer questions that are maybe not directed to you immediately. So let me start with Ioannis' paper, which is certainly very interesting. So my first question would be, you mentioned the fact that the phenomena of bir millet, iki devlet, so one state, one nation, two states, served already from the early 90s, more or less as a symbol, if I understood you correctly, a symbol of romantic nationalism. And then the last decade, more or less, it turned into a more politicized phenomena, with, of course, huge consequences when we look at the Second Karabakh War. I'm wondering, because certainly in the 1990s, during Geydar Aliyev, but also I believe the first decade of Ilham Aliyev, also this the phenomena of pan-Turkism, for instance, or having too close ties with Turkey, that was also perceived as a kind of threat for Azerbaijanism, or a real typical Azerbaijani collective identity. So the pan-Turkism, or looking for close ties with Turkey, that was more the narrative and the ambition of, well, first of all, Elçibe, but later also opposition parties such as Musafat. So what made this change is my first question. Was it purely a kind of pragmatism, for instance, with regard to Nagorno-Karabakh? Turkey is a crucial ally here in this war. Without Turkey, the war would have most probably had a different result. I mean, the Second War. This is related to the same question. What is the role of the EU in this change of narrative with regard to Turkey? Because I understand that the role of EU is both in Turkey and also in Azerbaijan more and more perceived as a negative role when we look at, for instance, mediation with Armenia. I mean, as long as Karabakh still was a de facto state in the hands of the Armenian population. But also with regard to Turkey, EU was more and more seen as, well, no longer an ally that is worth to be part of, due to the not very successful efforts to become EU member. Well, this is my first and also second question. Then another question would be, as you explained I think that is very interesting. When AKP started, or in the first, I don't know, decade of Erdogan, he tried to find a kind of mediation with our Armenian population of Turkey with regard to the genocide, for instance. There was at least more space for dialogue, or also with regard to the relationship with the Kurdish population, also with regard to Cyprus, as you explain in your paper. And this absolutely changed again the last, well, probably since Gezi Park, I guess. So what caused this change? What is the role of EU here? So was this mediation with Armenia, or with the Kurdish population, or with Cyprus, was that merely a kind of window dressing in order to create a better relation with the EU, for instance, so 10 to 20 years ago? But secondly, leaving this policy of finding a dialogue, for instance, with Armenians and Kurdish people, could be a possible threat for domestic stability. Does that play a role at all for Erdogan, or is this not one of his aspirations to look for this kind of stability with the non-Turkic parts of Turkish society? Then another question would be in this whole dynamics, what is the role of Russia here, and in how far does a strong alliance between Turkey and Azerbaijan, especially during the last decade, weaken Russia? In the very beginning of the Second Karabakh War, Russia did play a role as a, well, peacekeeper. I don't think that is the correct word, but anyway, Putin was the one who brought about a ceasefire in November. But Putin's role is certainly weakened since November 2023. What could you say about this role of Turkey? Well, looking with an eye on the time, I have more questions, but maybe I should switch to one of the other, to the next presentation of Anahit. There is one more question for you, Johanna. What I think is very, very interesting is you compare Israel, that is more or less, well, it's my very primitive words, hijacking USA policy with regard to Middle East situation, and you compare that to the way that Azerbaijan is hijacking Turkey in a way. These are my words. I think you, when I recall it correctly in your paper, that they have de facto a veto right developed. So the smaller country, the David, is hijacking the Goliath. What could we say about let's put it that way, in how far does the conflict in the war in Gaza since October 2023, in how far did this change this phenomena of Israel, for instance, hijacking the United States? Okay, now Anahit, thank you very much. I think you gave a very nice picture of how of the interaction between, well, certain political events between Russia and Turkey, and in how far these events are depicted, or in how far these events in fact influence the image of Erdogan as depicted in Izvestia, the Russian newspaper. The most important, let's say, key phenomena that you mention is the Sultan Caliph image. And you mentioned the fact that this image is normally used in Izvestia, which is obviously a very pro-government Russian newspaper, that this image normally has a negative connotation because of the, well, ancient animosity between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. What I find very interesting here, but I don't know what you think about that, is the Sultan Caliph image of Erdogan is also mirroring the relationship that Putin has with his own patriarch. So a Russian Tsar, or a Russian, it was in fact the same under Stalin or Soviet leaders, and it's a continuation for Putin. There is this very strong relation between church and state. It was always there, even in the secular, so-called secular Soviet Union. But in Russia, the face of this relation church state is the president or the party leader that is and who has a very loyal puppet which is the patriarch, but also the leader of Islam in Russia, or also the leadership of Buddhism and Judaism, the official religions. That is different in the case of Turkey, or let's say that the late Ottoman Empire, as far as I'm correct. Sultan and Caliph should be one person. So is it thinkable that whenever this negative image is used, is that they also have in mind, because it's a Russian newspaper, this negative image of someone who wants to be the leader of state and church in the same time? Because I'm asking it for this reason, there is a very interesting difference, I believe, between Russian nationalism or Turkish nationalism. But correct me if I'm wrong. Turkish nationalism, I think, is much more about finding one, let's say, ethno-Turkic national identity, whereas Putin is deliberately avoiding this kind of idea about nationalism. For Putin, it is very crucial to avoid any kind of idea of ethnic nationalism. It should be a kind of supra or multi-ethnic patriotism, which is so crucial because Putin fears disintegration of the Soviet Union. So in this sense, I believe Putin and Erdogan are also very different leaders, although they have, I believe Erdogan copied many of Putin's very successful techniques to become a very strong leader. So I would like to hear some of your reflections about this other way of looking at the Sultan Caliph image with regard to Erdogan. This was a very long question. I'm sorry. My second question is connected to you mentioned the Russian Eurasianism, which increased more or less at the same time that we saw in Turkey the rise of a certain kind of Kemalist Eurasianism. At a certain time, this Kemalism changed into, let's say, a neo-Ottoman Eurasianism. First of all, when did it happen? What was the reason or the cause of this? And secondly, what about then what happens with the role of Atatürk? Because I believe it might be very difficult for Erdogan to distance himself from the Kemalist heritage. So maybe you could say something about that. Then my third question, you investigated the narrative as created by Izvestia, which is a Russian newspaper in the Russian language, targeted at the Russian public. In how far is this a threat also for Turkey or also for Azerbaijan or other countries that are part of the so-called, what Putin likes to call his near abroad? We all know that Putin is very well talented in his soft power, in his propaganda. So what is the influence of this narrative of Izvestia in mass media outside of Russia, in this case in Turkey or in Azerbaijan? Yeah, then my last question for you, Anahit, how did the idea of, this is about Crimea, this question. So in the very beginning, after, you don't call it, by the way, in your paper, the annexation of Crimea, but let's call it the situation with regard to Crimea. In the very beginning, Erdogan supported certainly Ukraine, and this changed. Huh? When did it change, and how does this influence the relation with Ukraine? And what could you say about the relation with the Crimean Tatars? The relation and with Erdogan, I mean. So far my questions for you, Anahit. And then Sevinj, thank you very much for a very interesting paper. And my very first question would be, since if I'm correct, you are not only a scholar, but also working as an activist and a feminist, so also working in the field. So I would like to hear certainly about your experiences as an activist and a feminist. What could you say about your own experiences with regard to feminism, gender roles, and the dynamics between what you call masculine governmentality and these gender roles, and maybe also experiences of people you work with in the field? Then secondly, you mentioned the fact that there is the creation of, let's say, there is an ambition of masculinity, which is very much a kind of social pressure for most men in Azerbaijani society. In how far is this actually perceived as a pressure, or consciously or maybe unconsciously? And or well, what are your thoughts about it? Because I could imagine that for most people it's also very well, dangerous, or to express any doubts about this social pressure. Then secondly, if you look at the role of, well, feminism, or the way women should behave in Azerbaijan, and when you compare this to a neighboring country, Iran, what could you say of the role here? Because in Iran there is much more, I believe, a visible kind of repressive power against a certain behavior of women, but there is a visible also dissent of women in Iran that is challenging this power and the regime of the Ayatollahs. The repression of the regime in Azerbaijan is less obvious, less visible, but unfortunately also the dissent of women against this pressure is less visible and less obvious. So I would be very interested in what you have to say about that. Yes, then my third question is also, well, this at the one hand, this, as far as we see a kind of female power in Azerbaijan, well, I think the role of that Mehriban Aliyeva plays is a wonderful symbol of this. It's for a great deal, in fact, a kind of window dressing. It's not so much a real kind of political power, but she has to be also a symbol of real being a real woman, whatever that may be, and maybe a mother of the country, symbols like this. And it in how far do you think this is a continuation of the window dressing phenomena of feminism also in the Soviet Union? Feminism was one of the pillars of communist policy. And yes, in a certain way, they were successful. I mean, there was much more social mobility among women in the 1920s and 30s when you compare it to, for instance, my own country, the Netherlands, or many Western countries. But at the other hand, there was never real political power for women. So we could also look at it not as a new phenomena connected to Ilham Aliyev, but also an heritage of Soviet Union. Yeah, so far my questions for you, Sevinj. And then well, you also mentioned this would then be a bridge to Naira. One of the things you mentioned that is also the fact, which also comes back in Naira's paper, is that you see a clear transition in after the Second Karabakh War from the personality cults with regard to Geydar Aliyev to a cult which is completely focusing on Ilham Aliyev, which brings me to our last paper, Naira's paper. As far as I understood, Naira, you have been focusing on the difference between you have been focusing on speeches that Ilham Aliyev gave for a domestic public in Azerbaijan. So I wonder if you found also differences when you look at speeches that were presented for a public at home and then abroad, I mean, and then did you see differences when in speeches that were directed to the EU or the United States or Russia or other countries, for instance? Well, then there is also actually the same question I also had for Johannan, which is linked to the phenomena of pan-Turkism. You mentioned that, well, Geydar Aliyev was actually the first basis for power of Ilham Aliyev until 2020, the Second Karabakh War. And Geydar Aliyev was not only, let's say, the first president that brought Azerbaijan from the mid-1990s a certain kind of economic prosperity, etc. But Geydar Aliyev is closely linked to the Soviet heritage. So Soviet heritage was, I guess, less problematic in the first decade of Ilham Aliyev's reign. And only in the second decade of Ilham Aliyev, so roughly after the annexation of Crimea, you can see a switch, I think, with regard to looking at Soviet heritage and looking for closer ties with Turkey. So when did this change, and what could have been a possible catalyst for this change? And then there is one question of of great, let's say, geopolitical concern. As you say, Ilham Aliyev embodies continuity, and you're also thinking of dreaming of his son Geydar again being the next president. In how far is the population waiting for such a continuity? I can imagine that, yes, now still everyone is celebrating the wonderful victory of the 2020 war and the last victory of last year when the final part of Nagorno-Karabakh of Artsakh was, let's say, incorporated by the country in the country. But one could imagine that this legitimacy based on the last victory might decrease, you know, if economic worships or problems raise. If this glorious feeling about the victory decreases, might that be a threat? I mean, a threat with regard to, is it possible that Ilham Aliyev is looking for new victories in order to stabilize his continuity? So I'm now thinking of other parts of Armenia, or what can we say about South Azerbaijan and the relation with the Azerbaijani population of, well, North Iran. Yes, well, then the very last remark, your remark with regard to this Shusha mosque, and that's Ilham Aliyev being the designer. That is, well, for me, it's very much kind of Soviet tradition of Stalin being also an architect and designing buildings, or Lenin, a real leader in this context is not only a political leader, but is in fact some kind of Übermensch that can do anything. Anyway, I just like this this example of Shusha Mosque is very symbolic, I believe. So far, my questions.
Thank you very much, Sara, for this so deep and complex questions. And now I would ask our panelists to address, but I want us to limit ourselves within 2-3 minutes each, because it's really getting late. So, Ioannis.
Yes, I have 7 questions, so I'll try to make it in 3 minutes. Let me first start with the questions we received from our audience. We can ask about to what extent is the Israeli pro-Azerbaijan and pro-Turkey influence on US foreign policy guided by the Israeli perception of Iranian threat and Israel's reliance on hydrocarbons via Jehan port? Well, I would like to highlight here that over the last 10 years at least, Israel-Turkey relations have deteriorated significantly. And what we're witnessing now in Gaza is just a symptom of this. So in that respect, I wouldn't say that, of course, Azerbaijan is a completely different story because of the Iranian dimension and because of the perception that Azerbaijan provides some intelligence or sort of some facilitation to Israeli operations against Iran. So the higher the perceived threat that Israel feels by Iran, the higher the perceived value of Azerbaijan in that respect. But Turkey is no longer part of this. So I think we should disconnect it. So what was interesting is that until very recently, Turkey-Israeli trade relations would continue despite the heavy rhetoric. And there was a lot of domestic criticism against the government of Erdogan that made him kind of put some flesh on his very anti-Israeli rhetoric by announcing embargoes and sort of sanctions that actually hurt Turkish companies a lot as well. So that was not something that he was meant to do. I have another question on the meaning of democratic backsliding. This is a term that is used in democratization literature, which highlights the fact that the country moves away from becoming consolidated democracy and towards becoming a hybrid regime, whereby autocratic and democratic elements coincide in a very sort of hybrid way. To give you like an example, look into how, on the one hand, freedom of expression and sort of minority rights have deteriorated in Turkey over the last decade, but on the other hand, the opposition managed to win a big victory in the recent local elections. This shows you that the situation is complex. It's not Azerbaijan, right, where the opposition has no chance of winning anything in an election environment, but it's not a fully fledged democracy either. So this is what the democratic backsliding term is trying to capture. Regarding the questions that Sara very eloquently highlighted, let me go over them as quickly as possible. You mentioned how Aliyev used to represent a more cautious position against Turkey compared to Elchibeyi. This is true, but I think that Azerbaijan's leverage over the last couple of years has increased, and I think there's a financial dimension as well, that Azerbaijan is becoming a cash-rich country, and Turkey needs cash flows, investment or support of the exchange currency, and this gives Azerbaijan additional leverage, and they feel more confident to bargain and negotiate with Turkey from a more sort of, from a stronger position. So this has changed, I think, the relationship. The role of the European Union, well, the European Union takes a lot of criticism because at least it claims to base its foreign policy on values that it cannot kind of live up to, right? So the European Union appears to be weak or inept or inefficient. What is interesting in EU-Turkey relations is that while the relationship It's changed. So it's not a norm-based relationship any longer. There is no ambition on the EU to turn Turkey into a democracy. But the relationship remains very important as a pragmatic relationship, where two sides have clear issues and clear concerns, and there is a tit for tat. I think migration is a very good example of how Turkey is a very important country for the European Union, if only as a buffer zone for migration from the Middle East. Many European countries would be happy to give Turkey funds in order to keep as many refugees or migrants as possible so that they don't continue their journey towards Greece, Bulgaria, and then Netherlands or Sweden or anywhere else. So the relationship is different, but it's no less important. And I think that's something that both sides know. Although this doesn't lead to democratization any longer, it doesn't. So the EU is willing to tolerate the democratic backsliding to levels unprecedented 10 or 15 years ago. Regarding the question on the first years of Erdogan, I think that Erdogan back then felt that he needed international legitimacy. So he needed the EU support and the Western and the American support because he felt that he couldn't control the state and he couldn't control the military. By the time he felt strong enough to control the state completely, and by the time he saw that the European Union was not interested in a Turkish full membership, but Turkey could get along well even without an EU membership perspective. So he kind of felt stronger, and he decided to follow a solo career, let's say, a solo role in international politics. He was no longer seeing Turkey or himself as a sort of an ally or a surrogate of the West. And I think this is something that still goes on. And it's a big question mark, of course, because Turkey has become stronger, but it's not as strong maybe as its leaders may think. And this may generate a lot of risks and sort of a lot of tensions in Turkish foreign policy. And we see that in many areas. Regarding the role of Russia, well, I think that we can make an interesting reference to what we discussed already, the role of personalities. While structurally speaking, Turkey-Russia relations are no better where compared to 10, 15 years ago, the countries disagreed on strategic issues. They had conflicting interests on a wide array of topics. I think this close relationship between the two leaders and, of course, Putin's wish to drive a wedge against the Western security community through Turkey created an opportunity for Russia to develop this close relationship with Turkey, where, however, I think that there is this clear asymmetric dimension in that relationship. So Russia has some sort of an upper hand, and Turkey is willing to accept that, but of course they can make a regional deal. In a sense, Russia accepted Turkey's wish in the Karabakh conflict, but Turkey is willing to accept Russia's wish in Syria or in other areas. So it is a sort of a very complex relationship, which is bound on this kind of conflict with the West and Turkey's sort of search for a new position in global geopolitics. Final question on the role of Israeli foreign policy and what is the war in Gaza change on this? Well, I think that what we're witnessing in Gaza is, in a sense, the end result of this inability of the US foreign policy to shape the developments in the region so that it produces a peaceful solution before the war and before the extremists on all sides took the upper hand and kind of imposed the fait accompli on all the sides. But having said that, it's still very difficult because right now where things are getting from bad to worse, and we need to do damage control first in order to see how a new understanding of US foreign policy in the Middle East is going to emerge, because of course there are many Americans who are tired of Americans' involvement in global affairs, and they would like the United States to either focus on its domestic issues, and there are a lot of domestic issues to address right now in the United States, or focus on the Pacific and China. So they kind of see that let's prevent the next conflict in Taiwan before we're getting into deeper strategic trouble after Ukraine and after Gaza. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking more time.
Thank you, Ioannis, for this important answers. Now, maybe Sevinj, you can answer questions.
Yeah, sorry, Anahit. I think we didn't follow the sequence because I just texted Naira that I have to really leave. And that's why I will be really quick in answering. Thank you so much, Sara, for this very, very comprehensive analysis and questions. So it will be very hard to put it briefly, but I just want to mention, like, maybe not start in sequence what you asked me, but to start in reverse. From the last question, which is about the image of Mehriban Aliyeva and this whole politics behind. Is it resembling more like Soviet politics or the neoliberal governmentality? So my whole theory is connected with governmentality and neoliberal governmentality. And of course, Soviet Union had its own version of governmentality, and authoritarian traditionalism is exactly what you mentioned about the Soviet Stalin era authoritarian traditionalism, which completely changed the communist revolution from whatever was ongoing in the 1920s, and that's why, yeah, Stalin era techniques and tactics were still used in most of the post-Soviet states. So but what is a neoliberal about it? So that's why I bring that Mehriban Aliyev's image is not Soviet-style woman. I can argue, I can talk more about how the Soviet gender regimes were created and so on, specifically the case of Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, which I have researched more. But it's different. It's completely different from what the Soviet Union had. The image is there. Yeah, double burden is there. The labor is there. The image facade is there. But this is something completely different. Here we have a completely different regime, which is owning everything. So it's really very much related with the political economy of the country. Mehriban Aliyeva owns a lot of things in Azerbaijan and beyond Azerbaijan. This is completely different from a Soviet woman who didn't own anything. So she has quite a lot of power, and she is. Of course, on the symbolic level, her power is not visible because she's kind of standing behind Ilham Aliyev, but she has a lot of power, and not only her, but there are lots of other women who has power, and that's why the whole power, the concept of power, goes beyond just the idea of domination. She is not dominant in terms of her let's say family relations, where Ilham Aliyev is dominant as a patriarch of the family, but she is dominant in many other ways. So this is how the power circulates in society. The same way the Azerbaijani man, to your next question, which is how the masculinity is enforced or reinforced or not. And it's very much similar in many societies and many post-Soviet societies. I mean, the Azerbaijani man and Armenian man are not so different in their encounters with the military masculinities. They are grown in these military masculinities. They are forced to go to the military. So it's pretty much same. The narrative around gender, the masculinity or hyper masculinity, is also very similar. I can even include Georgia here because my experience has been mostly with civil society organizations, feminists and queers from the region, from Armenia and from Georgia. So we don't have much difference. And that's why I don't want to position Azerbaijan in that sense to Iran or to the Middle East in terms of the gender relations, because it's completely different history, completely different dynamics. It's more situated in the post-Soviet space, let's say, and that's why it has so much similarities. But the only difference, and I always mention it, between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia in terms of when it comes to civil society and gender dynamics, is how political regime responds to it. And if in Georgia, most of these organizations or networks or social movements, feminist or gender social movements, if they are on the front line, for instance, right now with what is happening in Georgia, if in Armenia, most of them came to power, to the governments after the Velvet Revolution, it's a completely different picture in Azerbaijan due to the nature of Azerbaijani political regime. But they are not so different. The civil society dynamics are not so different. yeah, that's why my own experience, I will conclude here. So I'm outside of the region, living outside of the region for several years now, but I'm in contact with a lot of activists and networks, and we are still trying to do some form of activism online or offline, and this is mostly based in Georgia, and networking and doing a lot of activism that would first of all look at the geopolitics of the region. So it is mainly about how the current dynamics of, for instance, EU-Russia relations or EU-Russia conflict is affecting the whole region. What is the economic source behind it? What is how sanctions affect it? Like, there are so many levels of analysis and activism that we are looking at. So when we talk about feminism, it's not just about services that women receive, but it's also about the general political economy that creates these conditions. Yeah, I will stop here, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sevinj, for your contribution, and looking forward to meeting you soon.
Yes,
Anahit?
thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your questions. These are really interesting, especially the first one. This is a really different perspective that I didn't think about. So when I plan to elaborate this paper, maybe I'll think about this perspective also. But now, when I was thinking about the question, I guess calling Erdogan caliph, this frame especially was for inner public, and they were trying to highlight Erdogan's relation with ISIS, just to show that Turkey is an Islamic country and it's not safe for your life, so don't go to Turkey as a resort country. But your perspective also is very interesting, and maybe not maybe, but I'm sure I'll try to look to this frame also from this perspective. Regarding the second question about Eurasianism and neo-Ottomanism, actually, when AKP party came to power, they started the policy of zero problem with neighbors, and this historiography of contemporary Turkey said that from this policy we can talk about neo-Ottomanism, which became more vivid maybe after Arab Spring. And also, if I'm not mistaken, you said that cult of Atatürk can be changed, transformed to cult of Erdogan, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, what I had in mind is that what about Kemalism, as Atatürk is still a hero in Turkey, but
yes, okay.
part of the neo-Ottomanism. So is that problematic for Erdogan to keep alive Kemalism and at the same time taking distance from a secularism, as was it perceived by Atatürk? This was the idea.
Of course, the secularism in somehow is not accepted as in the perspective as before the AKP came into power to Turkey. But this is the fact that, and I guess Erdogan is a very wise politician, and he will not change the fact, and he also doesn't challenge the cult of Atatürk. But in fact, we see that maybe he wants. Maybe it's not right to say that he wants to change or to merge he's called. But after the COP of 2016, the role of army in the policy of Turkey was decreased. And maybe I'll pass to the third question regarding the impact on narrative of Izvestia to abroad, if I'm not mistaken. I can tell my personal experience. When this jet crisis began, I was living in St. Petersburg, and we had a lot of Turkish students in our university, and they had some concerns regarding the Russian-Turkish relationship, and because they had fears of war, because that was a very difficult situation. And they told us that Turkish society, of course, they don't know. Majority of them don't know Russian, and they couldn't read it. I can talk about only academic cycles. They had some concerns. They especially those academicians who were in the field of Russian studies, Slavic studies. They had this fear, and this newspaper had impact on them. And regarding to the last question, Crimea, Erdogan always and now and then always protect the integrity of Ukraine. And even after the jet crisis, he called Erdogan invader. And if I'm not mistaken, also he called him terrorist. But he or Davutoglu. So maybe last 2 years he doesn't call him as invader, or he doesn't emphasize the fact, but he always protects the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And regarding my opinion, you said that I didn't mention that this is annexation of Crimea. I tried to just to show the facts, to write about the facts, and maybe there is a perception that I didn't accept it as annexation, but in fact this is the annexation of territory of one state by the one.
I didn't mean to criticize you here. I just this was not my intention, and I appreciate the way you wrote it down, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anahit. And now I will try to answer Sarah's question. The first one was about the Ilham Aliyev's discourse in the speeches addressed to the international audience. Yeah, I read his speeches also addressed to this international audience when I've been writing my article on dehumanization of Armenians and creation of this enemy image in his speeches. And what I noticed is that in the international public, in the audience, he's always mentioning the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. But unlike the domestic audience, he never connects this discourse with his father's image. So he sometimes very shortly mentions the legacy of his father, but he never goes to this narrative about his father that as a savior of Azerbaijan and him as a continuator of this policy. He never mentioned this in the case of international audience, but his rhetoric discussing the conflict is mainly from the perspective of international law. Even phrases are to be understood from this international law perspective. He uses phrases, terms like refugees, IDPs, territorial integrity, and etc. But when he's addressing the domestic audience, his rhetoric is quite sharp, quite aggressive toward Armenians, and in this context, his father's image plays very important role. So I think that he doesn't need some kind of he doesn't need to legitimize himself in front of the international audience using his father's figure. But in the case of domestic audience, he always does this. Regarding your second question about the continuation of what we see now after 2020, the first part of your question was about the perception of Azerbaijani population. Unfortunately, to answer that question, we need to do some research inside Azerbaijan, which is impossible currently, and especially impossible for me. But for the second part, whether we can see this continuation or whether he will need some new victory, of course, because we see this right now. So 2020 war, then September crisis, then ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, and now capturing some parts of Armenia proper and presenting that as new, let's say, small victories, which keeps his discourse alive. And what will come next, of course, depends on not only what he wants, but also what we will see in Ukraine, what kind of situation or what kind of involvement the US and Europe will have in this region. So it's not just about him wanting something, but yes, we see this aggressive continuation of this aggressive rhetoric currently as well. Yeah. Thank you very much. Sarah, if you want to add something.
No, thank you all four of you for your very interesting answers. I'm very thankful. No, I don't want to add something because I could imagine that everyone is a bit tired, especially if you're in the east of Europe, because it's already after midnight. So I would like to thank you all for your papers and also your great answers.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Our contributors, those who joined and asked questions. I don't see any new questions in chat box. So Hagop, maybe you want to add something.
Thank you very much, Naira, and thank you for all the panelists. This is an excellent discussion, even though it went a little bit over time, but that's fine because we will have a lot of people viewing it on YouTube, I'm sure. So, and also quite a few of the participants remain till the end, which is a very good sign. Thank you very much. And we're working on another panel discussion or a presentation for June, but we will let everybody know. Thanks again, and we will hopefully see you again some other time. And goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.